everybody, it's Matt here at the Mirage Library, and today I'm going to be talking about Star Wars: The High Republic, a new series of graphic novels, adult novels, comic books, and kids books that Star Wars has been coming out that I really like. But first, let's set the scene a little bit. There we go. That said, anybody who knows me knows I love Star Wars, and I've loved Star Wars for a really long time. Even though, in the past, there have been some pretty sketchy storytelling decisions, like an over-reliance on nostalgia-bait characters, character deaths that don't really mean anything, characters inexplicably being brought back to the dead, like Darth Sidious, which ultimately undermines the finality and weight of Anakin's final sacrifice. Lots of really weird storytelling decisions. Luckily, though, we are not talking about the expanded universe, we're talking about the High Republic. These titles are all hot off the press in the Star Wars High Republic multimedia line. We're talking about Star Wars: The High Republic, which you can think of as kind of an era within the fictional history of the Star Wars universe. Basically, you've got a timeline with the original movies starring Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher happening here, the prequel movies with Ewan McGregor and Natalie Portman happening here, and the sequel movies with Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver happening over here. The High Republic takes place way over here, like 100 years over here, if not more, which is cool for a number of reasons. Mainly, if you don't know anything about Star Wars, which if you don't, thank you for staying with me for so long, it's actually a really solid entry point. And if you do like Star Wars, you get to see an entirely different era with entirely different heroes, villains, while gaining some insights into the Star Wars universe as a whole. The High Republic is split up into several different lines of adult novels, teen novels, kids chapter books, graphic novels for adults, graphic novels for teens, and graphic novels for kids. And all of these different lines of books and graphic novels are released in phases. It's very reminiscent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and to be frankly spoken, it can be kind of confusing sometimes, and that's coming from me, which really says something. I mean, the first adult novel I actually read was the first book of Phase 2, but it ended up working out because Phase 2 is prequel, happens before all of the stuff that happens in Phase 1. So it's, so I wasn't super lost reading it. I was able to jump in fairly easily, but like I said, I'm also a gigantic nerd who loves Star Wars. So, other folks who might not be as familiar with Star Wars might have some issues with that. So pay attention to what I'm going to say next, because I'm going to go into exactly where you should start if you're interested in this. To keep things simple, I'm just going to say right now, there is a line of adult graphic novels, children's graphic novels, adult novels, teen novels, and chapter books. Truly something for everyone. I'm going to go ahead and put on the screen right now which book or graphic novel you should start with for each age group, all of which are available from your local library. I'm now going to go ahead and list all of the titles that I've read in the order in which I read them and with the format that I read them in. You'll notice I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. They're fantastic for long drives in the car. You also might notice that I read these in a wild order, which might flavor my perceptions of them, but I think also serves as pretty good proof that you don't need to worry too much about the order in which you read these. You'll notice I read these in a lot of different formats, going from e-audiobooks to hardcover books to paperback comic books to online comic books. I did that because I know a lot of people have, different ways they like to read books or comic books, so I wanted to get a good sampling so that way I can understand sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each medium. Although I will say, based on the list you just saw, you can probably tell I really like audiobooks. Like I said earlier, I love audiobooks, so I'm going to talk about the audiobooks first. And I think the audiobooks are an amazing way to experience these stories. For the first reason, sound design and sound effects have always been a super important part of Star Wars. In fact, one of the Oscars the first Star Wars movie won was for sound design and special effects. And all of the audiobooks have backing tracks, different musical scores, they'll have sound effects, which really, in some stories they can feel corny or cheesy, but in Star Wars, a lightsaber fight just isn't the same without the telltale whoosh of a lightsaber being ignited, or the clashing of the blades, or the thrilling music. So I love those aspects of the audiobooks. I also love our audiobooks. Most of them are narrated by Mark Thompson, who he does a phenomenal job narrating these books. Every character has a unique and consistent voice throughout the book, so there will be times actually where a character will say something, and I'm sure in the written word it's a mystery who it is, but if you're listening to it, you'll learn to recognize the voices, so you'll kind of be ahead on the ball, because you'll be like, oh, I recognize that voice, this is so-and-so, oh my gosh, what a plot twist. So that's really exciting, and not only are the voices unique and interesting, he's also a phenomenal actor. There are moments in this book where I remember one of the main characters is betrayed by another, and just the emotion he put into his voice left me shaken. I was driving to work and I was having this emotional crisis in the car. It was incredible. I cannot recommend it enough.
The e-comics available on Hoopla are great for comic fans and non-comic fans. What makes the e-comics better than a regular comic book is that when you read them, you'll actually click through it like a slideshow, with each click focusing your entire screen on a particular speech bubble, sound effect, or character. Sometimes when I'm reading a comic book, I'll have trouble following along when there's a particularly jam-packed sequence with lots of details and characters all speaking at once. Since the e-comic book will guide you through the comic one speech bubble at a time, it's actually very easy to keep track of what's going on.
And fans of comic book artwork need not worry, because the e-comics still make sure to emphasize those really amazing multi-page spreads, and they'll even make sure to zoom in on the very important details that can sometimes get lost in those huge artworks with tons of different characters and action going on. And the thing about Star Wars is it's just such a cool medium for comics, because the books do what they can to describe what the characters look like, or what the action looks like, or where these people go. But Star Wars is just filled with such amazing planets, these far-flung galaxies, these really cool and unique aliens and droids and creatures that need to be seen to be believed. In fact, a really good example I can think of is one of the antagonists in this series is this race of sapient plants called the Drengir, which it's really cool to see them in action. The books will try their best to describe them, but until you actually see a giant moving mass of flowers and vines with teeth in comic book form, you don't really get it. I don't have too much to say about the standard printed materials. They're your standard books and comic books. I do appreciate the font choices, and they do have some cool headers for chapter 1, chapter 3, and I do appreciate them because they will also say, they don't just say chapter 1, they'll say chapter 1, aboard the Voyager or whatever starship they happen to be on, which is, it's a nice touch. It's the little things. And again, the comic books have really cool artwork too.
The art style they chose for the kids' comic book line, Adventures, is very interesting and definitely a departure from other Star Wars kids comics that I've seen. I'm not sure if it's my favorite, but it's cool to see the Star Wars comics branching out and trying new things. The novels all have solid covers, and I enjoy the typeface they use. Again, nothing outrageous or out of the ordinary to say about any of these print materials.
I'm now going to be doing a bit more of an in-depth review of two titles that I read, Light of the Jedi and Convergence. Convergence was actually the first adult novel I read. This is a funny story about this. Is actually the prequel to this. But I'm going to go a little in depth about these two. I'm going to talk about things I liked, things I disliked, the characters. It might get into some spoiler territory, but I'm not going to try to spoil anything major. At least I hope not. But fair warning, I'm going to talk about these books. This is Light of the Jedi. It's the first adult novel in the High Republic series, and the one I'd recommend starting off with first. This book is a really great jumping off point, because it begins with an opening crawl that describes things like, these are the Jedi, the Force gives them their powers, hyperspace is how people travel from place to place, which are these very basic concepts that I feel like anybody who knows even anything about Star Wars is going to be remotely aware of. But the fact that it starts with establishing these super basic given circumstances makes it a really strong jumping off point, not just for people who are new to High Republic, but people who are new to Star Wars in general. And I really appreciate that, especially in this age where, it almost feels like every new Star Wars show or movie you gotta do like homework just to watch. So this book skips around a lot of different viewpoints from a lot of different characters, but there is only like one major antagonist in this story, and that's Marchion Ro. So, and because of that, Marchion Ro, this bad guy, and all of his allies feel like more fleshed out characters than anybody else in the book, which isn't to say the heroic characters aren't interesting. You have lots of different heroic Jedi, like Logan Greatstorm, and his Padawan, Bel Zettifar, who actually has this really cool moment where he learns how to do a free fall and then use the Force to stop himself right before he hits the ground, which is like this really cool metaphor for him sort of gaining the skills he needs to become a knight and kind of growing into the person he was always meant to be. You also have Avar Kriss and Elzar Mann, who have this really cool dynamic between them, and there's actually this also really cool moment where the two of them join their Force powers to create this sort of Force Gestalt mindset that they use to conjure rain from the sky to cool down a supercomputer. That sounds really crazy, but I promise you it's really cool in the book. Read the book, it's very cool. But yeah, so the hero characters are cool in this book, but they're all working together to stop the one main antagonist, Marchion Ro. So Marchion Ro is this pirate who is the leader of this gang called the Nihil. And what makes the Nihil so dangerous is they have access to what are called paths, which are basically different ways that they can travel through hyperspace. And it's a way they can travel through hyperspace that is utterly baffling and impossible to the Jedi and the Republic. And in fact, it's actually one of the Nihil ships collides with a Republic vessel in hyperspace, something that the Republic didn't even think was possible. And it creates this huge disaster where all of these spaceship chunks are being spat out of hyperspace, meteors, they're about to hit planets and things like this. And it's this huge, dangerous disaster, and it's really cool because you get to see it from multiple different perspectives as it happens throughout the galaxy. So you really get a sense for how scary and terrifying this is for the Jedi and for the Republic. And going back to Marchion Ro, the disaster is not even something he planned. It's a total accident. But everything he does throughout the books is just him capitalizing on that. He's definitely the most, if life hands you lemons, make lemonade character in Star Wars, which is really cool to see, especially from a villain. Because he's not this conniving Sith Lord who's orchestrating the whole war. He's not this, Grand Admiral Thrawn type who's got contingency plans for contingency plans for contingency plans. He's really just flying by on the seat of his pants. And this chaos that he brings to the table really fits in with sort of the ideology of the Nihil as a whole, which is they're pirates, so it's wanton plunder and destruction for its own sake, for the sake of becoming more powerful, which is this amazing foil to the High Republic, to the Republic in this era, who they fight for order and unity. Their catchphrase that happens several times throughout the book is, "We are all the Republic." Right? There are these very, conflicting ideas, right, of chaos versus order. And what makes it even more interesting from the perspective of a longtime Star Wars fan is if Marchion Ro was alive during the reign of the Empire, he would be one of the good guys. He would be an anti-hero like Saw Gerrera and his partisans, or Enfys Nest and the Cloud Riders. Because those characters are also very dangerously anti-authoritarian, anti-government. But because the government Saw and Enfys Nest is protesting, is fighting against, is the Empire, they're heroic, right? Because we know the Empire is evil. But because the government Marchion Ro is fighting against is the Republic, which we know is good, he's evil. So it's this really cool way to illustrate this gossamer thin line between liberty and anarchy, right? Like this very nuanced political take that's very interesting.
I also have to give credit where credit is due. The voice that Mark Thompson gives him in the audiobook is really good. It's not the deep, powerful rumble you'd expect, but it's more halting and deliberate and has sort of a lilt to it. It really gives the vibe of someone who's so angry they're calm. It's a far cry from the deep James Earl Jones baritone of Darth Vader, and it works really well. It made me really like this character, and hopefully I can play a little sample of it right now.
Don't react, he told himself. Don't yell. Just stare her down. Stare into the barrel of the gun. Let no one see your fear. What are you doing?
All in all, Light of the Jedi is a really great stepping on point for the High Republic. It's an amazing way to get started with the series if you're a longtime Star Wars fan or if you're brand new to Star Wars, which, again, I love that, because I swear, like the Ahsoka TV show, I feel like you needed to watch like 7 seasons of Clone Wars and Rebels to even understand what was going on. It's a breath of fresh air to be able to pick up a Star Wars book and not even need to know anything about Star Wars. Just a total clean slate, total new characters, and this delivers phenomenally. So this is Convergence, which is actually the first book of the of Phase 2 of the High Republic, and is actually the first adult novel that I read. I think this is a good jumping off point if you are already familiar with Star Wars, but if you're not so familiar with Star Wars, and even if you are, I still think Light of the Jedi is a much better starting place. That said though, this is the one I started with and I was able to get right into it. I wasn't confused, because again, it's a prequel to Light of the Jedi, so it's all new characters, all new locations, so it's easy to jump in from there. So Convergence is primarily the story of 2 young couples and the forces that drive them together and drive them apart. The main setting for this story are 2 planets, Arano and Iram, which are tidally locked, meaning they orbit one another, and they even share a moon between them. So it's 2 planets, but they orbit the same moon and are always constantly rotating around one another. Which, I don't know if that's exactly scientifically possible, but that's like a really cool science fantasy concept, and it's also like a really cool metaphor for what happens in the story, so I love that. And the thing to know about Iram and Arano, these 2 planets, is they have been at war forever. They literally call it a forever war in the story. It's generations and generations. These planets have been constantly fighting each other, with intermittent ceasefires happening intermittently, right? So the action of the story starts during one of those ceasefires. And of course, during the ceasefire, it ends rather explosively, and the crown princess of Arano, Princess Ziri, ends up crash landing on Iram, the enemy planet, but it's okay because she's rescued by Fontu, the crown prince of Iram. So I think you can already sort of see where this is going. It's very much a, Romeo and Juliet, Montagues and Capulets situation where you have the 2, crown heirs to these warring planets, end up falling in love with each other. But unlike Romeo and Juliet, it's not this instant infatuation. It's actually a much more mature and interesting relationship. In fact, their marriage is arranged right from the get-go as a means of securing a peace treaty between the 2 planets. But after that, Fontu and Ziri learn to love one another, which is interesting because on the surface, they don't really have a lot in common. Ziri is this very hot-headed, dashing pilot. She's part of her planet's military. She's this war hero. Whereas Fontu is a street urchin turned royal because he was adopted by the Queen of Iram after his family was killed during the war. So on paper, they're these very 2 different people, but they both are, they both feel this great sense of duty to their peoples, to their planets. They're both very selfless. They're always trying to, help others and do the right thing. So they complement each other in a really unique way, and they like have skills that the other doesn't. So like, again, like Ziri is like this warrior, but like, Fontu is more of like, he's more of a civilian, so he has like, administrative skills and things like that Ziri doesn't have. So they complement each other in this like really nice poetic way, which is like really cool to see. Honestly, they're couple. Now obviously, not everybody on Irem and Arano is very thrilled about this peace treaty that's going to happen because of Ziri and Fontu. So there are forces from both planets and elsewhere that conspire to try to disrupt the marriage by killing one of them or framing the other side for some horrible war crime. So this is where our next couple is introduced. There is Gelanatai, who is a Jedi Knight, and Axel Greylark, who is the galaxy's most eligible bachelor. And if you know anything about Star Wars, you could probably also guess where this is going too. Gelanatai is kind of a loner. She takes her duty to the Jedi Order very seriously. She's very heroic. Whereas Axel Greylark is a disaster of a man who is constantly getting into trouble and is just as likely to get into trouble as out of it with his trademark wink and smile. It starts with Gela being dispatched there by the Jedi Order to help with the peace negotiations, right, to make sure that Fontu and Ziri are protected. And Axel Greylark is also sent as well because he was in prison for a gambling dispute, but his mom, the Chancellor, the leader of the galaxy, bailed him out of jail and said, "You have to get it together. I'm sending you here as a form of community service." Axel's great. So naturally, these two are joined forces and have to help Ziri and Fontu survive numerous assassination attempts and do their political duties, and it's a fantastic time. Like I said, Gela is very forthright, she's very heroic, whereas Axel is very opportunistic and underhanded, and he doesn't really take anything super seriously, so their relationship is tumultuous, to say the least. But despite that, they can't help but feel something for the other. There's these budding emotions in both of them that they both have difficulty processing because, again, on paper, they shouldn't be feeling the things they're feeling for one another. Gela's a Jedi. Axel has his own predilections for not liking Jedi. It's this whole thing. And there's actually, we're kind of getting spoilers here, but there's this moment where Gela and Axel are dancing at Ziri and Fontu's rehearsal wedding, and Axel point blank asks Gela, like, "Hey, listen, if I wasn't me and you weren't a Jedi, could this ever be something real between us?" And Gela thinks about it, and she says, "If I were not a Jedi, then I would not be who I am." They put it on the book. It's kind of important. And Axel just kind of agrees and says, "Okay, well, let's have this moment and nothing else." And he takes Gela's hand and they let it linger, and he kisses the top of it and they let it linger, and they just both know they can never be together, but they love each other so much, but they won't admit it, and I'm still hung up about it. So unlike Light of the Jedi, which I felt was a very sort of plot-heavy book, this book is a lot more character-driven, as you can tell, because I've spent most of my time talking about these, Ziri, Fontu, Gela, Axel, all these different characters. And I think it's for that reason that I like it more, because the hero, because I tend to always kind of, I like heroes more than I like villains in stories. So this book I liked a lot better because I feel like you get to spend more time with the heroes, and you get to know more about what makes them tick, and you get to see them be heroic more often. So I definitely like that better in this book than I did in Light of the Jedi. But that said, again, if you're looking for a starting off point, I cannot recommend Light of the Jedi enough as that starting off point.
That's been my Star Wars The High Republic Roundup. I hope you all had a good time and feel inspired to check out some Star Wars The High Republic stories from your local library real soon. If you have any questions or want to see what Star Wars materials we have available, make sure to check out our catalog at the website www.mcldaz.org.